A storm rolled across Kansas, flattening fields and flooding low ground. By dawn, Eli Mercer walked his land to check the damage and found 3 pale eggs half buried in the soil. They weren't rocks, they weren't bird eggs, and when he bent close, he swore the dirt whispered. Subscribe to the channel and write where you're watching this video from. Eli Mercer, 68, widowed farmer, lived quietly with his wheat and his memories. But that morning, the storm had left him more than ruined fences. It had left him something that should never have been found. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Eli Mercer's mornings hadn't changed in years. Sunup meant boots by the back door, coffee black as the soil outside, and the groan of the old hinge when he pulled his barn door open. Even after the storm, his hands moved in the same rhythm, pulling feed, scattering grain, rattling the gate for the hens. The small sounds of his land were steady, like a heartbeat he could count on. But the storm had left its mark. Fence posts leaned, soil puddled in low dips, and clumps of straw lay plastered against the siding where the wind had slapped them. Eli muttered under his breath, voice carrying that tired farmer's resignation. Storms got no mercy, knocks down what you build, leaves you to mend it again. His fields stretched out, a dull sheen from the rain still pooled in furrows. Walking the fence line, he caught sight of something pale at the far edge near the windbreak. At first glance, he thought it was debris, maybe a washed-out root ball or a chunk of limestone tossed up by the floodwater. When he reached it, he slowed. 3 oval shapes, half buried in the mud, not smooth like river rock, not jagged like stone. The surface looked damp, slick under the morning light. Eli crouched, frowning. He poked one with the handle of his shovel, expecting it to give like clay. Instead, it resisted, heavy, almost solid. When he pressed his palm against it, the chill seeped through his skin. Storm dragged in strays I don't want near my soil, he muttered, shaking his head. He wasn't a man to fuss over curiosities. Farmers didn't have time for that. If it wasn't wheat, fence, or cattle, it was someone else's problem. Eli brushed the mud off his hands and moved on, telling himself the storm could have carried anything from upstream a chunk of debris, maybe even an old storage drum torn loose. His land always gathered what didn't belong. But as the morning wore on, the sight lingered in his mind. Every time he glanced south, past the grain silos, and down toward that edge of field, he felt the odd shapes pressing at his thoughts. By midday, the air had grown warm, damp with that sour smell fields give after a storm. He worked steady, but his mind slipped back to the pale ovals. Curiosity pricked, the same way he felt when a calf went missing, and he knew he'd have to search the brush no matter how much he wanted to leave it be. Toward evening, Eli returned to the spot, shovel over his shoulder. The ground had dried some, cracked in thin lines from the heat of the sinking Sunday. The ovals still sat there, mud crusted at their bases. He crouched again, leaning closer this time. The shells were smoother than he remembered, not chipped or weathered like stone, but seamless, almost polished. He tapped the nearest one with his knuckle. The sound was dull, like knocking on thick porcelain. He frowned, shook his head, and stood. Best let it be, he muttered, dusting off his palms. Storm will take it back where it came from. That evening, Eli settled in, as he always did, kettle on the stove, lamp by his chair, the hum of cicadas rising outside. The day had left him tired, his shoulders stiff from hauling storm-torn fence wire. He told himself he'd forget about the things in the field come morning. But when he stepped out to latch the barn, he caught sight of them again, far off in the dim light. The sinking sun bled red across the horizon, shadows stretching long across his land. And there, against the fading glow, he saw it clear. The 3 pale shapes cast a shadow that didn't belong, not soft and stretching like the other fence posts, not shifting with the wind. These shadows cut solid and black across the dirt, sharp-edged and wrong, and they didn't follow the Sunday. They pointed east, away from the setting light. Eli stood frozen at the fence, breath caught in his chest, staring at the impossible 3 black shadows slanting the wrong way, crawling across his field like they had chosen their own direction. But soon, small details refused to stay hidden. The next morning, Eli rose before sunup, as he always did. Coffee hissed on the stove, steam fogging his cracked kitchen window. He drank in silence, listening to the early stirrings of his land, a crow's caw, the soft creak of the windmill out back. It was the kind of quiet he trusted, but when he walked out toward the field, he stopped short. The eggs were not where he had left them. They hadn't rolled far, just a foot, maybe two, but they were closer together now, pressed side by side as if they had been arranged. Eli stared at them, his boots rooted in the mud. The memory of those wrong-leaning shadows prickled his skin. He squatted, rubbing at his jaw. Storm wind couldn't have done that. No wind last night neither. His voice came out low, broken at the edges. He knelt closer, pushing the soil back with the edge of his hand. That was when he noticed it. Fine lines now marred the smooth surface. At first he thought they were cracks, the kind that clay pots showed when they dried in the Sunday, but no, these weren't cracks. They were ridges, branching like veins, spreading faintly across the pale surface. His stomach tightened. He drew his hand back. Dirt don't walk things. His mutter barely carried above the morning wind. He stood there for a long moment, shovel clutched in one hand, his knuckles pale. Something in him wanted to smash them open, to prove they were nothing more than hardened mud or river trash. But another part, the quieter part, warned him against it. A farmer's instinct, maybe the same one that told him when a storm was about to break or when a sick cow wouldn't see the next dawn. Finally, he scraped soil over them again, quick and rough, burying the pale shells until only the tips showed. He turned away fast, heading for the barn. But all through the morning, the image clung to him, those faint veins crawling across the shells. By noon the sun had risen high, burning moisture off the fields in thick waves. Eli worked along the fence line, resetting posts. Sweat stung his eyes, but the unease in his chest had nothing to do with heat. Every swing of the hammer seemed to echo too sharp, too loud against the empty air. He found himself glancing south more than he meant to, searching the line where the field bent toward the woods. When the wind shifted, carrying the damp smell of earth, he thought he caught something else in it, a faint metallic tang, like iron. By late afternoon, his resolve cracked. He took up his shovel again and marched back to the edge. The sun hung low, turning the wheat stalks gold, the air heavy with insects. Eli dug, this time striking deeper into the soil around the strange cluster. The shovel hit something solid, not stone, not root. The sound rang sharp and cold up through the metal shaft, a hollow scrape that made his teeth ache. He froze, leaning on the handle. The vibration thrummed in his palms, faint but undeniable, like striking an iron plate just under the skin of the earth. The noise carried in the stillness, not loud, not echoing, but wrong. The kind of sound that made a man hold his breath without meaning to. Eli wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve, muttering, "Ain't right, ain't natural." He prodded again, slower this time, and felt the same jarring shiver run up through the handle into his bones. Whatever was beneath that soil wasn't simple rock or flood trash. Something buried there had weight, depth, and the echo of emptiness inside it. He backed off, his breath uneven. The fading light cast long fingers across the field, shadows creeping over the pale shells he had half uncovered again. For a moment, Eli thought he saw those veins shift, faint as a pulse under skin. Then the wind died. In the hush, the iron scrape seemed to hang in his hands, echoing inside his bones as though the ground itself had struck back. By now, denial was no longer enough. That night, Eli slept in broken stretches, waking to every creak of the rafters. He told himself the scrape he'd felt in the field was just metal debris washed down from old machinery upstream. But by dawn, the unease had sunk too deep to ignore. He returned to the south edge with his shovel, sweat dampening his shirt though the air was cool. The ground felt different beneath his boots, firm in patches where the storm should have left it soft. When he drove the blade down, the soil resisted, clumped and packed tight like it had been pressed from below. He dug carefully around the pale shapes. The dirt came up in stubborn chunks, each one heavier than it should have been. The more he cleared, the more he saw. Scratches marked the surface of the largest shell, not random gouges, but thin, purposeful lines that curved outward, as if something had pushed against the inside. Eli froze, shovel midair. A chill ran across his arms despite the climbing Sunday. He crouched, tracing the marks with his fingertip. They were too neat, too deliberate to be accident. He muttered under his breath, "Ain't storm work, not storm work at all." The air around him was thick, pressing down on his ears. Even the insects had gone silent, the hum of crickets gone like someone had cut a string. The only sound was his own breath, and the faint grind of the shovel blade against the dirt. A prickle crept across the back of his neck. He turned, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. The world seemed to be holding still, like the pause before thunder. A voice broke the silence. "Mercer!" He startled, gripping the shovel tighter. It was his neighbor, Carl Hutchins, leaning on the fence that divided their land. Carl was a broad-shouldered man, his hat pulled low, face lined by years in the Sunday. He tipped his chin toward the mound. "That patch don't sit right," Carl said. His voice was flat, but his eyes flicked uneasily over the pale shells. "Like it's waiting," Eli swallowed, throat dry. "Storm tossed plenty. Don't mean nothing." Carl shook his head once, spat into the grass. "Storms don't leave things lined up neat. Ground like that, it don't let go easy." Before Eli could answer, Carl pushed off the fence and walked on without another word, his boots crunching against gravel. The silence returned, heavier than before. Eli knelt again, determined to prove the unease in his chest wrong. He pulled a tin pail from the barn, filled it from the pump, and carried it back. If these were just shells or trash, water would wash the mud clean. That was all. He tipped the pail. Water splashed across the pail's surface, running down the shells and into the dirt. But instead of soaking in, the droplets skittered sideways, hissing faintly as if the ground itself rejected them. The smell rose sharp and sudden hot iron cooling after a forge strike, acrid and metallic. Eli stumbled back, the pail clattering to the ground. The shells glistened in the light, unmarred, as though the water had never touched them. Around their bases, the soil steamed faintly, dry to the eye, though the rest of the field lay damp and dark from yesterday's storm. His hands trembled against the shovel handle. From above, the three ovals gleamed pale against the scorched dirt, the steam curling up in twisting threads. And the smell of metal lingered in his throat, as if the field itself had breathed it into him. That morning, the ground itself seemed alive. Eli woke with his jaw clenched tight, teeth aching from a night spent grinding in his sleep. He told himself he'd stay away from the south fence line, keep his hands busy with the cattle, but his boots carried him there before the sun had cleared the horizon. The field looked the same from a distance, gold stubble, damp furrows, trees bending in the early breeze. But when he drew near the mound, the difference hit him. The earth around the pale shapes wasn't just dry now, it was cracked in thin, radiating lines, like a spider's web cut into the soil. Eli pressed his boot against one fissure. The ground flexed beneath him, not much, but enough to make his stomach tighten. He spat into the dirt. "This don't belong in daylight," he muttered. Still, he couldn't leave it. He lifted his shovel and struck hard into the edge of the mound. The blade hit something with a ringing clang that jolted his arms to the shoulder. The vibration rattled his chest, echoing deep, like a blow struck against a hollow tank. Eli gritted his teeth, crouched, and scraped away the soil. The dull gleam of metal surfaced beneath his shovel, a broad, flat plate buried under only a few inches of earth. He brushed it with his sleeve, smearing mud away until faint stenciled letters showed through. EDN 9. Restricted. The words made no sense to him, but they didn't feel like anything that should have lain under Kansas soil. His breath came short, clouding faint in the cool morning air. He ran his hand across the cold surface, feeling seams where the metal joined, edges fused clean like no farm equipment he'd ever seen. He whispered, almost to himself, "This ain't storm work. This ain't even farm work." He crouched lower, ear to the plate. At first he heard only the silence of his land. Then, faint and steady, a sound reached him. Thud, thud, thud. Like a slow heartbeat, muffled and deep, echoing up through the ground. He jerked back, dirt sticking to his knees. The shovel clattered against the plate, ringing too loud in the still air. For a long moment he crouched, frozen, sweat rolling cold along his temples. Curiosity and fear pulled him both ways, twisting his gut. Every instinct said leave it covered. And yet he found himself brushing more soil away, fingers trembling, as if uncovering just a little more would give him answers. Then it came. The earth gave a sudden lurch, a short jolt that rattled the tools in his belt and shivered dust from the branches above. The sound that followed wasn't like wind or water, it was a hollow crack, deep and resonant, that rolled through the ground beneath his boots. His chest vibrated with it, ribs trembling as though the land itself had exhaled in one hard breath. Eli staggered back, heart pounding, shovel still gripped tight in white-knuckled hands. The pale shells trembled on the surface, dust sliding from their curves, while the hidden plate below gave off one last faint, echoing knock not random, not accident, but measured like someone striking back. Engagement prompt. Would you call for help if you saw the ground breathing? But the discovery refused to stay buried. That night, Eli lay on his back, staring at the cracked ceiling. The windmill creaked in the dark, the rafters groaned, And still his mind replayed the sound he'd heard, that slow, muffled thud rising through the plate, like a hidden heartbeat. He told himself it was machinery, maybe some old Cold War dump site, rusting away under Kansas soil. He even muttered it aloud, trying to believe it. Scrap metal, nothing more. But the words carried no weight in the silence. Around midnight, a new sound began. At first it was faint, a slow tick, 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 sharp, metallic, carrying through the boards of his house. Eli sat up, bare feet on the cold floorboards, head cocked toward the sound. It wasn't steady like a clock. It faltered, paused, then returned stronger, echoing faintly through the walls as if the nails themselves were tapping back. He lit the kerosene lamp, the flame flickering weak in the stale air. The tick seemed to follow him as he paced the kitchen, rattling spoons in the drawer, making the lamp glass tremble in his grip. He pressed his ear to the wall and felt the faintest vibration, like something crawling beneath the plaster. Eli gritted his teeth, forcing a laugh that came out dry. "Storm's just got the house unsettled," he muttered. But when he glanced out the kitchen window, his stomach dropped. Far off, near the south fence line, the field glowed pale, not bright, not like fire, but faintly lit, as though the soil itself had caught the moonlight and was holding it. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and still the glow lingered. The pale eggs were faint lanterns in the dark, their curves outlined in mist. He stood frozen at the window, lamp glass hot in his hand. The ticking grew louder, steadier, almost in rhythm with the glow. On the counter by the stove sat his wife's framed photograph. He reached for it, fingers brushing the dusty glass. His voice cracked as he whispered, "You'd tell me to quit this foolishness. You'd tell me not every secret needs digging." The photograph didn't answer, but the silence around him deepened, swallowing his words. Unable to stay indoors, Eli pulled on his coat and boots and stepped outside. The night air carried a strange dampness, sharp and metallic, stinging the back of his throat. His breath plumed in the cold, and each step across the yard seemed too loud. When he reached the barn, he noticed the dirt near the door had been disturbed. Fresh prints marked the mud boot prints, wide and deep, too large for his own. They led across the yard, straight toward the field. Eli followed with his lamp raised high, the light quivering against the black soil. The prints sank deep as if whoever made them carried great weight, but halfway across the field, they stopped. No turn, no retreat, just stopped. The last print ended in front of the mound, where the pale shapes gleamed faintly in the mist. Beyond that, the ground was smooth, sealed tight, as if the earth itself had swallowed the rest of the trail. Eli's chest tightened. He backed a step, the lamp rattling in his shaking hand. His breath clouded fast in the cold air, too fast, too shallow. The glow from the eggs pulsed once, faint but certain, and the ground where the boot prints vanished gave off a low, hollow groan as though something beneath had shifted to make room. By morning, he was no longer the only one who noticed. Eli hadn't slept more than an hour. He sat hunched on the porch as the sky shifted from gray to pale gold, watching the south fence line. The glow had died with the night, but his eyes still strained that way, waiting for it to return. By mid-morning, word had spread. First came the Hutchins boys on their bicycles, cutting across the dirt road that bordered Eli's farm. They slowed when they saw him sitting on the porch, then pointed toward the south field. One called out, his voice sharp with mockery, but carrying an edge of unease. "Mercer's got things hatching out there." The other added, "Ain't no chicken eggs neither." They pedaled off laughing, but the sound rang hollow, fading too quick against the still air. Eli gritted his teeth, fists knotting in his lap. He could tell from the way the boys kept glancing back that their laughter was as much to chase fear as to mock him. By noon, 2 more neighbors slowed their trucks along the road, craning their necks to look at the far side of Eli's land. Folks didn't usually give his fields a second glance. Wheat was wheat, rows were rows. But today, their eyes lingered. One man leaned out his window, shaking his head. "Storm, don't leave things shining like that," he muttered, just loud enough for Eli to hear. Then he drove on, tires spitting gravel. The talk reached town by evening. Eli knew because Carl Hutchins himself came back, his jaw tight, hat brim low. He didn't bother with a greeting, just walked straight up to the porch and planted his boots hard on the bottom step. "You stirred something you ought not have," Carl rasped. His eyes didn't quite meet Eli's, instead darting toward the field. "Ground's been closed for a reason. My daddy told me storms put back what they drag in. But you went digging." Eli's throat was dry. "You telling me you knew about this?" Carl's jaw worked, chewing the inside of his cheek. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then he leaned closer, his hand gripping the railing hard enough to creak the wood. Once it's touched, he whispered, it don't just sit quiet again. It waits, it grows, and it don't give back what it takes. He turned and left without another word. Eli sat in silence long after Carl's boots had faded down the road. The air seemed heavy, humming faintly against his ears. When dusk came, Eli forced himself to walk back out to the mound. His heart hammered hard with every step, his lamp trembling in his grip. The shells sat where he had left them, pale and cold, but the soil around them had changed. A perfect ring circled the eggs' blackened earth, charred and brittle. The wheat stalks at the edge were seared halfway down, curling inward like clawed fingers. He crouched, touching the edge with his fingertips. It crumbled to ash at once, and the smell rose sharp, not burnt wood, not coal, but the acrid bite of singed straw mixed with the electric tang of ozone. The stench clung in his nostrils, thick enough to make his stomach lurch. The night air was still, no breeze stirred the wheat, yet the ash along the circle stirred faintly, as though something beneath it exhaled. Eli staggered back, his chest heaving. From above, the circle glowed faintly red in the dusk, a perfect scar scorched into the earth, while the smell of ozone thickened until it burned his throat, and the pale shells inside the ring seemed to be waiting. The secret was no longer his alone. By the next morning, Eli could feel the eyes on his land. He noticed trucks slowing on the county road, drivers leaning long over their steering wheels. Children dared each other to run to the fence and touch a post, then sprinted away, screaming. The talk in town had grown too loud, and the field had become a spectacle. That evening, 3 boys sneaked through the wheat and dared each other closer to the mound. Eli caught the sound of their laughter, nervous, not joyful, and shouted from the porch, "Get out of there!" But before they bolted, one dropped to his knees and pressed his ear to the ground. His face drained pale. He stumbled up, yelling to his friends, "It's buzzing," like wires under the dirt. Then they tore off, vanishing into the dusk. Eli's heart hammered. He'd heard the same hum at night, faint in his walls, crawling through his bones. The next day, his cattle broke the fence line. A dozen head crashed through posts and barbed wire, bawling and thrashing like something had driven them mad. Eli and his hired hand, Jonah, fought to turn them back, but the herd refused to go near the south edge. They circled wide, eyes rolling white, nostrils flaring. One heifer stumbled and split her leg, lowing in panic, until Eli put her down with a clean shot. That night he sat on the porch, the rifle across his knees, staring at the dark horizon. His land was no longer steady ground. 2 days later, official trucks arrived. They weren't sheriff's cruisers or county surveyors. These were unmarked utility vehicles, their paint dull, their windows black. Men stepped out in pairs, moving briskly, their boots heavy against the gravel. They wore no uniforms. Eli knew thick gloves, rubbery masks that hid their mouths, Idaho tags that only read in bold block letters, "Contractor." One of them squatted near the mound, brushing the scorched soil with gloved fingertips. "Still active," he muttered, voice muffled. Another nodded, jotting something on a clipboard. "Doesn't fade, not here." Eli moved closer, fists tight. "This my land. You best tell me what you're doing on it." The nearest man looked up, his mask reflecting the lamplight. "You stirred something old, Mercer. Some signs don't stay buried." His voice was low, flat, stripped of emotion. Eli's throat tightened. "What signs?" The man stood, brushing ash from his gloves. "The kind you can't cover twice." Before Eli could press him further, they returned to their trucks. One vehicle carried a sealed canister in its bed, a heavy steel drum with warning stenciled faint across its lid. They hauled it down by winch and lowered it carefully into the earth beside the mound. Eli watched from the porch, every nerve on edge. The men worked with quiet precision, as though they'd done this many times before. The canister disappeared into a pit they dug in minutes, the soil swallowing it up like water closing over a stone. When they finished, the lead man gave Eli a final glance. "Stay away from the circle." His tone was final, no explanation offered. Then they climbed into their trucks and drove off into the dark, their taillights swallowed by the night road. Eli stood frozen long after they were gone. The night insects had fallen silent again, leaving only the faint hum that rose from beneath the earth. The mound looked unchanged, but when Eli stepped closer, lamp trembling in his hand, he swore the soil where the canister sank gave off a faint tremor, as if the ground itself had swallowed more than metal, and was deciding what to do with it. Now the law stood at his fence line. 2 mornings after the unmarked trucks came and went, Eli found a county cruiser parked by his gate. Sheriff Donnelly leaned against it, arms folded, hat low against the Sunday. But Donnelly wasn't alone. 2 men in pressed shirts and clipped ties stood beside him, carrying clipboards and wearing the kind of polite smiles that felt carved from stone. "Morning, Mercer," Donnelly called. His tone was too casual, too smooth, like he was talking in front of strangers who needed convincing. Eli wiped his palms on his jeans. "Morning. You come to fix my fence or stare at it?" One of the suited men chuckled softly, writing something on his clipboard. "We're here on behalf of the state. Environmental oversight. Legacy contamination." Eli frowned. "Contamination? I seen plenty of storms. Never one dropped a pile of eggs and metal with government stamps on it." The man's smile didn't falter. "Mercer, it's simple. You've got unstable ground. Old disposal site. Back from contracts no one keeps anymore. Nothing to worry yourself over. You keep farming. We'll handle the rest." Eli's fists clenched. "Don't tell me not to worry when I seen cattle break their legs running from it. Don't tell me when the dirt's buzzing like it's alive." The other man stepped closer, clipboard tucked tight under his arm. He lowered his voice, words clipped and heavy. "Keep digging, Mercer. You won't be the only thing buried out there." The threat landed cold in Eli's gut. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't even angry. It was quieter than the breeze, and that made it worse. Sheriff Donnelly cleared his throat. "Best listen, Eli. No use making trouble for yourself. These boys will be back later with equipment. Just stay clear." They turned, walked back to their vehicles, and drove off without waiting for his reply. Dust curled up behind the cruiser, hanging in the air long after they disappeared down the road. Eli stood by the gate, knuckles white around the fence post. His chest rose and fell in ragged bursts. Every word they'd spoken had been slick and vague, but that one line, that one warning cut through like barbed wire. That night, unable to sit still, he walked back out to the south field. The moon was high, silvering the wheat. He carried only his lamp and the small tin flask he'd kept from his father. The mound lay quiet, but the scorched ring around the eggs seemed darker, more defined than before. He crouched, brushing ash away, when something fluttered against his boot. A torn scrap of paper, half buried in the dust. He picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The ink was smudged, the handwriting hurried and jagged, but the words were plain, "Closer than we planned." Eli's breath hissed between his teeth. Planned. That meant someone knew. Someone had put it there. Someone expected it to stay hidden until now. He stared at the eggs gleaming faint under the moon, their pale shells rimmed in black soil. The hum rose faint again, crawling into his bones. Eli clenched the scrap in his fist, the words burning in his mind, while the ground beneath him gave a faint shiver, not enough to topple him, but enough to whisper that the plan was no longer in human hands. Engagement prompt. "Do you think this is natural, or something far darker?" What the experts saw made their faces turn pale. By the weekend, a caravan of trucks rolled into the county. Not county cruisers this time, not state sedans. These were flatbeds carrying strange equipment, long poles with sensors, steel crates with hazard stencils, men in canvas suits that didn't belong in Kansas fields. They didn't ask permission. They parked by Eli's south fence, cut a padlock, and drove straight in. Eli stormed down from the porch, fists swinging. "You can't just—" One of the men cut him off without looking up. "Site's registered. You don't own what's under it." The words made Eli stumble to a stop. Not own what was under it? Since when did a farmer's deed stop at the roots? The crew set up scanners around the mound. Tall rods bristling with wires hummed as they sank into the ground. Lights flickered on their screens, jagged lines dancing across them. Eli stood close enough to see one man's face stiffen, lips pressed thin. "Reading's wrong," the man muttered. "Shouldn't still be active." Another leaned in, his voice sharp. "Backscatter's pulsing. It's awake." Eli's skin crawled. He edged closer, lamp in hand. "What's awake?" No one answered him. They worked faster, digging shallow trenches around the mound, exposing seams of metal below. Eli glimpsed rusted rivets. A pipe split open like it had been under pressure too long. From inside the crack seeped a faint glow, cold and pale, not bright enough to blind, but enough to make his stomach twist. He stepped closer. A man shoved him back with a gloved hand. "Stay clear." Eli shoved back. "That's my field, damn you. What's in it?" The man didn't answer. But Eli's eyes caught on something half buried in the churned soil. A canteen, rusted through, stamped with an insignia he didn't recognize. Next to it lay a torn patch of cloth, faded letters, too worn to read. He bent down, but before he could grab it, a sound froze him. Tap, tap, tap. From below, faint but steady 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, the sound of knuckles against glass. Eli's heart stuttered. The crew froze too, their instruments buzzing, screens jumping with jagged red spikes. One man hissed, "It knows." They scrambled, covering the crack, shoving soil back over the pipe, sealing it with canvas sheets and clamps. Eli staggered back, bile rising in his throat. The glow had died, but his skin still prickled with it. He turned to demand answers, but the men were already shoving him away, barking orders into radios. The sound of generators filled the night, drowning out the insects. Eli stumbled to the fence, gripping the post to steady himself. He looked back once more and froze. On the surface of the mound, condensation misted across a square pane of glass he hadn't noticed before, faint and grimy with soil. The fog cleared in streaks, and for one terrible moment, Eli saw it, a palm pressed flat against the inside. The print was fresh, sharp, pressed so hard that droplets of melt still trickled down its edges. The hand dragged slowly downward, leaving 3 long streaks across the glass, as though whatever was beneath had woken and wanted out. By nightfall, the whole town was talking. News never stayed buried in a place like this. By morning, pickup trucks lined the county road, neighbors leaning against hoods, binoculars in hand. By noon, media vans arrived, dish antennas rising against the Kansas sky. And by evening, Eli Mercer's farm looked less like a field and more like a stage. He stood on his porch, hat pulled low, watching them gather. Protesters carried cardboard signs painted in black. "Our dead deserve rest. No more poison in our soil." One woman shouted through a bullhorn, her voice cracking. "You buried our fathers here. You buried them and thought we wouldn't know." The crowd roared back, the sound jagged, broken with fear and anger. Eli's chest tightened. His father had farmed this land before him, and his father before that. The idea that it might hide the remains of other men never spoken of turned his stomach sour. Reporters shoved microphones toward him when he stepped off the porch. "Mr. Mercer, do you confirm there's a military site beneath your property? Have you seen bodies, artifacts, chemicals? Do you feel safe staying here?" Eli shoved through them, jaw locked. "Ain't nothing safe about what's under there, and I sure as hell wasn't told about it." The shouting only grew louder. Flashbulbs burst white against the dusk. Someone in the crowd threw a stone that clattered off the fence post, drawing more jeers. At sundown, convoys of official trucks forced their way through, shoving protesters aside. Men in masks set up floodlights that bathed the mound in harsh white glare, shadows stretching long into the wheat. They wheeled in equipment on gurneys, sealed steel crates rattling as they hit the ground. The crowd pressed closer, voices surging. "You can't take him off his own land. Tell us what's under there. Seal it before it spreads." Eli felt the pressure of eyes on him, hundreds of them, burning through the floodlight haze. He wanted to vanish into the dark, but his land held him, anchoring him like iron chains. A sudden silence swept the crowd as 2 men wheeled a covered gurney up the mound. The sheet over it quivered faintly, a small shift that no one wanted to acknowledge. One protester gasped, covering her mouth. Another reporter shouted, "What's under there? What are you hiding?" The men quickened their pace, pushing the gurney past the eggs and toward the waiting crates. But then it happened. The sheet jerked, not a little twitch, but a violent spasm that made the metal frame rattle. The sound split the air, a wet, choking gasp, muffled but undeniable, like something struggling to breathe after being too long in the dark. For a heartbeat, the floodlights hummed and the entire crowd stood frozen. Then someone screamed. Eli staggered back as the gurney buckled under its own weight, the sheet rising and falling in sharp bursts, while every floodlight around the field flickered, plunging the circle into a stuttering rhythm of light and shadow. Then came the men who spoke in whispers. The day after the gurney gasped, the government moved faster than gossip could. Bulldozers rolled in before dawn, their engines grumbling low. Trucks dumped fresh soil, covering the scorched ring, pressing the pale shells back beneath a new layer of earth. Within hours, the mound was gone. Or at least, it looked gone. Officials erected fencing topped with barbed wire, posted signs stamped hazardous material keep out. Floodlights still stood, but now they faced outward, keeping people away instead of illuminating the ground. By midday, the protesters were driven off by deputies. Reporters shouted until they were shoved into vans. When the crowd was gone, the field looked empty, but the silence that replaced it was worse than the noise had been. Eli stayed on his porch, jaw set, fists on his knees. He felt like a prisoner staring across his own land. That night, a different kind of message came. A soft scrape woke him. He lit his lamp, heart thudding. At first he thought it was just a branch against the siding, but then he saw it an envelope shoved under his door, the corner wet with mud. He knelt, lifting it with shaking hands. Inside was a scrap of paper, the handwriting jagged, hurried, almost panicked. Tried before, failed. Don't dig. Don't. The last word was underlined 3 times. The ink smeared as though the writer's hand had shaken. Eli swallowed hard, the note trembling in his grip. Who had left it? A neighbor? One of the contractors? Someone who wanted him safe or silenced? The house felt suddenly too small, the walls pressing close. He set the note down on the table, but the words burned in his head all the same. Outside, the night was heavy, still. Then a new sound rose, a deep, uneven rattle. Eli stiffened, grabbing his lamp and rifle, and stepped out onto the porch. The sound came from the well. The old hand pump shuddered and shook as though something were trapped inside, the handle jerking up and down in short bursts. Eli approached slowly, boots crunching in the gravel, every nerve pulled tight. He touched the pump. It vibrated under his palm, trembling harder, as though the earth below were trying to push something up through it. With a sudden lurch, water spat from the spout, splattering against the bucket. Eli dipped his fingers in. The water was warm, metallic. When he lifted his hand, it dripped rust-red down his wrist. He sniffed. The stench of iron and ash burned his nostrils. The pump shuddered once more, then gave off a hollow groan, and for a heartbeat, the water running over Eli's hand felt thicker than water, like something alive was sliding through his fingers. Every shadow now felt like a watcher. Eli had always trusted the night the way a farmer does, knowing the creak of his barn, the low of cattle, the whisper of wheat. But now, the dark no longer sounded like rest. It buzzed. A faint hum threaded through his walls, steady as a drill burrowing into bone. At first he thought it was in his ears. He shook his head, covered them with his palms, but the noise stayed. A low, thrumming whine that rattled in his skull until his teeth ached. By the second day, his nose bled when he bent to tie his boots. By the third, his skin prickled with grit he couldn't wash away. When he spat in the sink, metallic flecks shimmered in the water. He stared at them, trembling. Shards, fine and glittering, like filings scraped off a blade. He cupped some in his palm, and the slivers sparked faintly in the light before dissolving to dust. His body was betraying him, grain by grain. That night, Eli sat on the porch with his rifle laid across his knees, but the weight of it gave no comfort. Every gust of wind sounded like boots in the grass. Every creak of the pump felt like someone's hand on the handle. He gripped the gun harder, knuckles white, but the buzzing inside his head drowned out even his own heartbeat. Finally, he called his daughter. Her voice on the line was warm, soft, so unlike the cold that pressed in around him. He pressed the receiver tight to his ear, forcing words out through his dry throat. "Say my name," he rasped. "Say it so I know it's you." "Daddy," she said, steady and firm. Eli Mercer." He closed his eyes, tears burning. "Keep saying it. Don't stop." Her voice carried through the hum, a lifeline anchoring him. But even as she spoke, the buzzing flared sharp, filling his skull until his vision blurred. He slammed the receiver down, unable to bear both voices at once. The silence that followed was worse. Eli staggered inside, gripping the table edge. His skin crawled. He ripped his shirt open, gasping for air. Red welts streaked his chest and arms, raised and angry. But they weren't just swelling, they moved. Tiny sparks crackled across the welts, stinging sharp like nettles pressed into his skin. The itch burned deep, as though the marks themselves were trying to crawl. He fell to his knees, slapping at his arms, leaving trails of blood where his nails tore the flesh. The static sting grew hotter, louder, until he swore he could hear it, a faint crackling under his skin, as though wires had been strung through him and were humming to life. He forced himself upright, trembling, clutching the edge of the counter. His breath came in ragged bursts. He stumbled to the window, staring out at the dark outline of the field. The mound lay quiet in the distance, but he knew the same hum filling his body was rising out there, too. Eli raised his hands to the lamplight. The welts glowed faint red beneath the skin, and the shards that had seeped from his mouth now sparked across his palms, stinging so sharply that the smell of singed flesh rose faint into the room. Engagement prompt. If this happened to you, what would you do? And then the last secret broke free. The night after the welts lit his skin, Eli drove into town. He didn't trust the roads anymore. Headlights felt like eyes. The hum and the wires overhead sang in his skull, but he had to go. Someone had to know. Someone had to tell him the truth. He found it in the county records office, a low building that smelled of mildew and paper. Inside, behind a locked door, sat an archivist he half remembered from years ago, a thin man with a whispery voice and hands stained by ink. The man looked at him like he'd been expected. "You came about the field," the archivist said, quietly. Eli's chest tightened. "What do you know about it?" The archivist slid a folder across the table. "Not mine to tell, but yours to see." Eli opened it. The papers inside were brittle, edges yellowed. Handwritten notes, signatures, government stamps. He scanned the words, the lines blurring as the hum in his skull grew louder. Land use contracts, subsidies, consent forms. His father's name was scrawled on more than one line, signed clean, dated decades back. Consent to let the government bury experimental incubators beneath the soil in exchange for payouts disguised as crop relief. Eli's hand shook as he touched the signature. His father's handwriting, the same loops he'd seen on every note pinned to the fridge, every invoice tucked in the ledger. The archivist's whisper cut through. "Your father signed with the rest." They knew what slept there. Eli's breath hitched. "Knew and said nothing?" The man's face pinched. "Whole county knew, Mercer. A deal's a deal. Land for silence. Silence for money. You think those new tractors just showed up out of nowhere? You think the bank eased your daddy's debt for kindness' sake?" Eli staggered back from the table. Betrayal burned in his chest, hotter than the welts across his skin. His father, his neighbors, all of them had known. They'd built lives on top of secrets, and left him to farm it blind. He shoved the file back, hands trembling. "And what about now? You buried it once. Tried again. Why's it waking?" The archivist's eyes darted to the door, voice dropping further. "Not all units stayed down. Some were moved, some unsealed." He pointed to a margin note scribbled in shaky hand, half faded. "Several released. No trace since." The room felt colder. Eli's stomach twisted. Released. Not lost. Not destroyed. Released. He pictured the pale shells, the pulsing glow, the palm pressed against the glass. His hands clenched, nails biting into his raw skin. "And no one thought to warn me?" The archivist swallowed. "Warn you? They meant you to keep it quiet, same as your father." Eli's knees nearly buckled. The room spun with the weight of it, his own blood tied to this. His family name inked into the paper that gave permission. The betrayal wasn't strangers digging into his land. It was his own kin. He staggered out into the night, clutching the copy of the file he'd torn free. The street was empty, the town silent, but the shadows between the street lamps seemed to shift when he passed. His skin itched where the welts glowed faint beneath his shirt. Out on the road, the fields stretched endless, the wheat bending in the breeze. And from somewhere deep in the earth, too low for most ears, Eli felt it, the hum rising sharper, answering the thrum of his blood. He pressed the file tight to his chest, his father's signature searing through the paper, while in the silence he swore he heard footsteps beneath the soil, not one set, but many, moving closer to the surface. But some secrets never truly stay buried. Eli left the county records office in silence. The folder clutched in his arms felt heavier than any sack of grain he had ever carried. His father's handwriting burned through the paper, a betrayal etched deeper than the welts crawling across his skin. He drove home with the window cracked, letting the night air wash over him, but the hum in his bones never faded. It was part of him now, a rhythm under his ribs that no silence could cover. At the farmhouse, he sat in his chair until dawn, staring at the worn photo of his wife on the mantel. "They all knew," he whispered. "All but me." The house gave no answer, only the faint tick of cooling rafters and the quiet drip of the pump outside. By the end of the week, he packed 2 suitcases and left the farm behind. He didn't look back at the south field, didn't watch the wheat bend over the hidden mound. His daughter's car was waiting by the road. She hugged him, relief flooding her face, But the embrace faltered when she felt the grit on his shirt and the faint crackle beneath his skin. "Daddy, what's happening to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eli didn't answer. He only climbed into the car, clutching the tin box where he'd kept one of the shards that had bled from his mouth. It rattled faintly with each bump in the road, as though the slivers inside were restless. In town, whispers spread fast. Some said the government bought Eli out. Others claimed he'd gone mad and fled. At the diner, old men leaned close, muttering that the ground south of his farm still glowed at night. Teenagers dared each other to ride out there, only to come back pale and silent. Carl Hutchins was seen at the feed store, eyes downcast, telling anyone who would listen, "It don't quit once it starts. Never did, never will." Newspapers ran short blurbs, half-truths printed between weather reports and commodity prices. "Activity at legacy site. No danger to public," officials say. Then the story vanished, buried like the mound itself. But for Eli, the burial never held. He stayed with his daughter in her small house on the edge of town. She tried to care for him, cooking soft meals, setting out fresh clothes, keeping the doctor's number ready. But every night when she reached to steady his trembling hands, she pulled back quick, her face tight with fear. The welts still glowed faint under his skin. Some nights they pulsed, faint red light showing through his shirt, casting long shadows on the walls. The hum filled the room, rattling the glass of the window, making the lamp flicker. Eli kept the tin box near his bed. Inside, the shard sparked faintly in the dark, a restless ember that seemed to breathe with him. He couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It was his proof, his curse, his tether to the land he could no longer claim. One night, long after midnight, his daughter sat beside him, tears shining in her eyes. "Daddy," she whispered, "please, let me call someone. Let me tell them." Eli turned his head, his voice low but steady. "No one listens. They never did. And it ain't stopping now." She looked at him, her lips trembling, then reached out only to recoil again as soon as her hand touched his chest. Her face drained. "It's not beating right," she whispered. Eli said nothing. Eli Mercer never returned to his farm. The wheat grew tall that summer, but the south edge stayed barren, a black scar cutting through gold. He lived out his days in town, quieter, slower, haunted by the hum inside him. He was no longer just a farmer tending soil. He had become soil carrying its secret inside his ribs. Locals still whisper about the Mercer place. Some swear the government still sends trucks there under cover of storms. Others say you can hear footsteps under the ground if you lean against the south fence long enough. No one dares to build on that land. Children dare each other to touch the posts, but none cross the field. And when Eli's daughter hugs him good night, she swears she feels it not a heartbeat, but a slow shifting weight under his chest, as though something inside is turning and listening.